Welcome to the webinar, Politics of Protest Policing in the US. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the Observatoire de Profilage is located on unceded indigenous land, which was never ceded. The Guanyan, sorry about that, Guanyan Oaxaca is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Not the cloud, but Montreal. Also, TJK, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, not only in Canada. Today, it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other people. We, members of the Observatoire de Profilage, commit to defend principles of solidarity and respect in the community and in our activities alongside First Nations. So we just also a quick intro on what is the Observatoire de Profilage, the Observatory on Profiling. We are composed by more than 30 scholars in 7 universities, not only in Canada, but mostly in Canada and in Quebec. We're talking about more than 20 partners. So it's a kind of research project that rolls in the long term. We're talking about 8-year research projects that works with institutional partners and community partners. So which means that we're doing research with them and to a certain extent for them as well. We had more than 40 students, graduate students, MA and PhD level. And we were developing the idea of the observatory is to develop new knowledge and new practice so about the experience on profiling, not only one particular kind of profiling, but different kinds of profiling, such as racial profiling, political profiling, social profiling, sometimes gender-related profiling, and so on. So it's a core value of the observatory. Also, this dimension of intersectionality of the profiling experience. So most of the time, they're not came only on one level, but they are experienced by different levels of profiling by target communities. In this sense, the presentation today on the politics of protest policing in the West is a key aspect to our research programs. It's topics that lots of the researchers involved, the partners involved, and the students involved in the observatory are key to listen. So we start with our first presenter. I think we try to save as much time and be strict as possible in my presentation because we're here to hear them and to have questions later. So our first presenter is Jennifier Earl, professor of sociology at the University of Arizona. She'll summarize what the literature has to say about policing differs based on the ideology of protesters. For instance, right or left-wing leaning movements of protest. She'll also discuss the role and consequences of the use of arrests to control protests in the West. The West legal system uses a low standard of lawful arrest and allows for very physically, emotionally, and financially difficult arrests and pretrial experience. Together, she highlights how this event has been used in the United States to apply significant sanctions to protesters without significant evidence of substantial court review. Welcome, Jennifier. The cloud is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me just get my PowerPoint running. Great. Okay. Thank you so much to the Observatory to all of the individual organizers. Thank you so much to the translators, and please, I look forward to seeing your hand raised if I don't give enough pauses or I go too quickly, and all of you who showed up today to participate in this event. I'm going to be talking today about two topics, but we'll start with how arrests without greater regulation operate as a larger repressive force than I think is usually acknowledged, both in the literature and more generally. Since this is a short panel, as opposed to, hour length full research presentations, I'm going to organize my talk around specific interventions that I think need to happen in the literature, as opposed to focusing or dwelling on data, methods, comparison cases, et cetera. But of course, I'm happy to discuss those during Q&A. My first intervention is to argue that researchers often talk about arrest versus violence as if arrests are not violent. Watching George Floyd's arrest in the United States should have clarified to many exactly how brutal arrests can be, hopefully convincing many to not assume that arrests are always or even usually nonviolent. In my own research, I have found that protest-related arrests often involve a great deal of actual violence, and when they don't, a great deal of symbolic violence. From my own research, some of which interviewed a random sample of 2004 Republican National Convention protesters who were arrested, I found accounts of significant violence in protest-related arrests. And the full quote is up here, but I'm just going to read bits and pieces of it. Kyle, who was arrested at the RNC, said, "I was tackled to the ground by 4 or 5 cops who piled on top of me. Once they got to the ground, they hit me with batons several times. They were being extremely vulgar and offensive, standing on my legs, mostly hitting me on my back with batons, pressing my face against the concrete. They were like, take that, motherfucker. This'll teach you." So let's see, once they had beaten me a little bit, they picked me up and put me in a van with one other person. Now, while Kyle's experience may seem extreme, his experience was similar to other people I interviewed, although certainly not ubiquitously so. I interviewed people who were arrested at mass arrest experience and did not experience that kind of violence. But I think his account gives us a sense of how violent those arrests can be. My second intervention is to make plain that arrest experiences, whether or not the arrest itself is violent, usually kicks off awful detention experiences, which are followed by equally awful legal experiences. I'll let people skim the quotes while I talk, but experiences involving the over tightening of handcuffs, which can lead to cuts on your wrist, loss of sensation, hands that turn white or purple, and in some case fainting, were very common experiences amongst the arrestees that I interviewed from the 2004 RNC. Although this kind of over tightening is exceptionally common with flexi cuffs, it can also occur with metal cuffs. Flexi cuffs are the kind that are usually used at mass arrest situations, and metal cuffs when arrests are more or in smaller order. But those metal cuffs can be over tightened too. In prior work in a 2005 paper, I look at a labor dispute that occurred in Arizona and show very similar findings with the use of metal cuffs. Once taken into custody, almost all arrestees were transported first to Pier 57, which was a temporary detention facility set up by NYPD, and then to Center Street Jail complex, often known as the Tombs, from which arrestees were ultimately released. Those transport experiences, according to many of the people I interviewed, were what police call rough rides, a policing phrase popularized in the United States through the Freddie Gray case, but a phrase that had been in policing for longer. Rough rides occur, imagine you're handcuffed, your arms are behind your back, you're in a transport vehicle where you're not seatbelted in. If the vehicle intentionally takes a lot of potholes, tight turns, you get thrown about, and you get a rough ride. And many of the people I interviewed reported these kinds of experiences. Even when their rides weren't rough, they might be difficult in other ways. So the bottom part of the slide is a quotation from a New York Times article on a bus experience. And actually, one of the people I interviewed was on this bus. But the New York Times reported the same key details, that basically a person being transported on the bus had Crohn's and used a colostomy bag, and it burst, which is a very serious emergent medical situation. The bus clamored for the individual to be helped, and the police did not seek to help the individual in any way. Once whoops, I think once you arrived at the pier, which was your first destination, that detention experience that you were starting was also awful. The temporary facility, Pier 57, was a chemical-stained bus garage that was so deplorable that afterwards, police who worked there during the RNC filed workers' compensation claims for the health effects of their work period there over the RNC. After the pier, people were transferred to the tombs, where rats, mold, and cold are part of daily life. At both facilities, arrestees experienced conditions that were harsh in a variety of ways, which I summarize in those bullet points. So, for instance, quite a number of arrestees pointed out that their access to food, water, and the bathroom was severely restricted. They were exposed, depending on the time of day and the facility, to extremes of hot and cold. They had a lack of access to medical care. The colostomy bag is one example, but there were also very routine cases. People needed their diabetes medicine. People needed other kinds of chronic medicine and didn't have them with them, and were told that if they insisted on receiving medical care, they would be put to the back of the line for release. And so if they had already been detained for 20 hours, they were essentially being told, if you ask for medical care, you are looking at 20 hours more of detention. Arrestees experienced frequent movement, particularly at the tombs between cells, which led to extensive sleep deprivation. And as you could imagine, these difficult experiences led to psychological difficulties for many of the arrestees, including due to uncertainty about how long they would be held, isolation from friends and family, and in some cases from attorneys for a period of time, their experience of very dehumanizing language from police and correctional workers, and intentional psychological manipulation. As is often true of the mass arrests that I've studied, those very awful detention experiences lasted for a long while. This is a reproduction of an NYPD internal document, and I have imposed a red line across the 24-hour mark, which is the statutory limit in New York for being held prior to arraignment. In black, the bars are the average length of detention for arrestees arrested on each day of the RNC, and the lighter bars are for other arrestees in New York City on that same day. You can see that protest-related arrestees tended to be held for significantly longer than non-protest related arrestees, and they tended to be held for long periods of time. I gathered independent data on this, which suggests that a number of arrestees were held for longer than this reports. And that is particularly true because arrestees marked the beginning of their arrest at the moment in which they were no longer free to go, which is the legal in the United States requirement for when a custodial arrest has commenced. But their booking paperwork may have reflected that their arrest occurred hours after they were no longer free to go. And also recall that these are averages. So some people spent considerably longer periods, ranging from 2 to 4 days before being arraigned or released on what is called in New York a desk appearance ticket. One should keep in mind that many of these protesters were arrested on violations, which are not criminal charges in the United States, and operate much more like traffic infractions than anything else. The other arrests were generally on very minor misdemeanors, like disorderly conduct, with a very few felony charges. What this meant is that for the vast majority of individuals who were arrested, if they could have pled guilty right before the flexi cuffs were placed on their wrists, paid a fine on the spot, and been free to go, they would have suffered less effective punishment than they suffered by being arrested and put through this system, no matter what happened to their charges. Malcolm Feely, in unrelated work to protest, has called this the process is the punishment, where you effectively use the process of arrest and detention as a punishment that's more severe than what can occur. And in fact, my third intervention is to highlight the way that we should already think about arrests as being particularly difficult, because Stephen Barkin pointed out the teeth of legalistic policing over 40 years ago. Arrests are very delegitimizing to protesters and movements because the arrests get reported, but subsequent paltry number of convictions rarely do. As Barkin pointed out, legalistic policing works by sucking resources out of movements, whether those resources are personnel, legitimacy, or money. Most of these charges, most of these arrests essentially don't convert into actual convictions. ACD is adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, which means if you don't get rearrested in New York State in 6 months, the case is dismissed. So for the vast majority of those, it's effective dismissals, which means that a conviction was epiphenomenal to the repression that actually took place in this instance. This leads me to a fourth intervention, which is to challenge the widespread idea, particularly amongst academics, that there is some continuum on which arrests are necessarily softer and are also separate from violence. This is a common assumption that underlies scales or indexes of repression, as if these incommensurable experiences can be made commensurate and ordered with arrests of lower magnitude. I'll also note that this does not conform to what my respondents directly told me about their comparison of violent experiences to arrest experiences. One informant told me that in a prior protest, he had had his leg broken, and he had also gone through the arrest experience of the 2004 RNC. And if he had to choose which occurred to him again, he would prefer the broken leg. My final intervention is to argue that real free speech and assembly rights cannot exist without reform to how arrests are done in the United States. And indeed, perhaps real due process rights can't either. At protest-related arrests, police effectively become the judges because they decide who will get the effective punishment of an arrest and face those pretrial punishments. Mere presence at protest events can be a justification for lawful arrests, even if prosecutors don't ultimately continue that case. Probable cause shifts to become the burden of proof that the state owes, which is one of the lowest burdens in our criminal justice system, as opposed to the burden that would be required to convict of being beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'll point out that in many cases, probable cause doesn't exist, but it's hard to challenge that because your only option is to civilly sue. And then the burden of proof switches so that you become the plaintiff and you have to show that the police essentially lacked probable cause. The burden shifts to you. What this did at the RNC, as in other protests, is it allowed NYPD to, in practice, do what could not be done by passing a law. They were able to criminalize protesters as a class. And even when protesters won civil suits afterwards, and they did, that was not able to provide a real remedy for their loss of rights of assembly and speech during this important public event. Moreover, as I point out in the bottom bullet, larger movements don't have standing, so they can't sue for the damage that's done to them by having so many of their members arrested. Fortunately, there are things that can be done in the US. We could disallow custodial arrests when a guilty finding could not result in jail or prison time. That would require a change because right now the US Supreme Court has made clear that such custodial arrests are okay. We could require the use of desk appearance tickets instead of custodial arrests because custodial arrests essentially act as selective incapacitators to protesters, whereas desk appearance tickets do not. We could require individuated probable cause that has on-site civilian review, such as requiring prosecutors be present when police are making custodial arrests at protests. We could also try to reduce arrest-related pretrial sanctions. What is clear is that without greater regulation, these kinds of constitutional violations in practice will continue. I want to pivot now to a last slide where I talk about the other topic that I was asked to address, which is about the role of ideology in policing. Here I'm going to draw heavily on David Cunningham's excellent past and current work, as well as work Heidi and I are doing on protest policing in the 1960s and 70s, looking at police trade journals over that period. Despite obligations in the US to content neutrality in the policing of protest and social movements, research shows that there are notable differences that exist on the basis of the goals of movements. So as Cunningham pointed out, for white hate groups in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s during COINTELPRO, they tend to be policed to change their tactics, but not to stop their movements. So Hoover wasn't trying to stop the KKK from promoting white supremacy. He was trying to stop the KKK from using violence. Heidi and I in our collaborative, but on the contrary, COINTELPRO was trying to stop entirely other movements. Heidi and I have shown, or finding in our collaborative work in the 1960s and 70s, that this extends to whole categories of groups being thought about differently by police. We see really prolific and negative writing about young people and their role in protest across this period. And we see also changing but largely negative views of protesters of color who get bifurcated into good protesters who follow the rules, but mostly bad protesters. As the second sub-bullet points out, the Kinds of repressive tactics also often differ. That was a tongue twister. As Cunningham pointed out, the FBI used informants and in-person visits to try to encourage white supremacists to use less violence or avoid violence, but to not discourage their participation in white supremacy. From COINTELPRO to today, progressive groups, on the other hand, in the United States, have been policed to try to stop their movements, for instance, in environmentalism by disarticulating their networks, and in other movements by surveilling belief systems, not just actual tactics. As I point out in the third bullet, police understandings of threat also differ, and that can influence repressive intensity. Heidi and I have seen this kind of carnival mirror of threat happening in the 1960s and 70s, with rampant beliefs expressed in the police journals about communist conspiracies and other plots to attack and delegitimate the police based on what the police saw as fake claims. David Cunningham's research on Charlottesville is showing this to be the case contemporarily. And David and I have an op-ed that we wrote last year after the January 6th insurrection, where we argued that that was what was happening with lax preparation for the January 6th rally and march that turned into an insurrection. In particular, police showed, second to last bullet point, a willingness to disregard threats that were posed by people that they saw as being similar to them, or maybe even overlapping in membership. So essentially, the police disregard credible information that would lead them to take other actions if they were to believe that information, whether that's because of police own interpretation, or in the January 6th case, also from political pressure from above. On the other hand, according to the last bullet, on the left, police have shown a willingness to believe otherwise completely far-fetched rumors about likely activities and plans for protest, and have aggressively planned to react to protest on the basis of such far-fetched and unsupported rumors. In other words, it would appear that in daily practice, even though content neutrality is very much required in the US setting, we're far away from achieving that. Those are the ends of my remarks today. I really hope I went at a speed that worked for the translators, and I look very much forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Earl. It was an amazing, brilliant presentation. We'll move to our second presentation before having a period for questions. So our second presenter is Dr. Heidi Reynolds-Stenson, Professor of Sociology, Criminology and Anthropology at Colorado State University. She will focus on her research on the disparate police response to protesters, to protest against police brutality compared to protests on other issues. She will situate these findings within the broader state of knowledge on predictors of police response to protests in the West. And if there is interest, and I'm sure there is, will also be available to answer questions related to the impact of state repression on protest participation and to historical shifts in protest policing. The cloud is yours.
Awesome, thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and just, can I get some confirmation that you all can see my first slide here? Awesome. So yes, again, my name is Heidi Reynolds-Stenson. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology and Criminology at Colorado State University in Pueblo. And I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm really thankful to all of you for putting this together. So over the last several years, the world has watched as outrage about police brutality, especially against young Black men, has spread across the United States as well as outside of the United States. Following police killings in Ferguson, New York, Baltimore, Minneapolis, and elsewhere, People have taken to the streets to demand accountability for those responsible and justice for the victims, as well as for communities where relations with police have long been strained. Police response to these demonstrations have, at times, added fuel to the fire and further provoked a national conversation, or international conversation, really, on police use of force and the militarization of police departments. The policing of protests against police brutality present a unique case to scholars interested in social movement repression and practitioners interested in protecting the rights of protesters. While police are tasked with maintaining order and protecting property, just as at other protests, the fact that the protesters they are policing are protesting them may shape the nature of police response in distinctive ways. One of the hallmarks of negotiated management, the term coined by McCarthy McPhail to refer to the model of protest policing that became dominant in the 1970s in the US and elsewhere, as well as of public forum law, is that police should be content neutral when policing protests, and in other words, should not take sides on the issue in question. While police may not always live up to this ideal, they may be especially unlikely to maintain such neutrality when policing protests against the police. Oh, sorry, it started going through quickly. Sorry. All right. So I ask, are police more or perhaps less likely to repress police brutality protests compared with other protests? More specifically, I was interested in figuring out whether or not police were more or less likely to attend protests against police brutality compared with otherwise similar protests making other claims. And then once there, were police more or less likely to intervene, that is, use force or make arrests at protests against police brutality compared with otherwise similar protests making other claims. Past findings and theory suggested two competing possibilities. On the one hand, police may feel particularly defensive over allegations of police misconduct, creating even greater tension between police and protesters than seen at other protests. And these protests directly challenge the legitimacy and authority of the police and may earn the ire of police to an extent that challenges to legislatures or corporations, for example, may not. Previous research on protest policing has found that police respond more aggressively to protests that are more threatening or perceived as more threatening, and particularly those that are perceived as more threatening to the police. And this is seen in Jennifer's work along with Sewell called Seeing Blue, looking specifically at the way that threats and perceived threats to police shape the police response to protests. So based on this, I thought, it was certainly plausible that police would be more heavy-handed in their response to police brutality protests compared with other protests. On the other hand, police may be especially concerned about public scrutiny of their response to these protests in particular, increasing perhaps motivation to avoid escalation and confrontation. Previous research suggests that police as a profession are powerfully motivated by reputational concerns and a desire to avoid public embarrassment. So it's possible that this might lead police to actually treat these protests with more of a velvet glove compared with other protests. So to adjudicate between these two possibilities, I analyzed data from over 7,000 protest events over a 35-year period using logistic regression. These data are from a larger data set, the dynamics of collective action, which includes over 20,000 protest events reported on in daily editions of the New York Times between 1960 and 1995. This data set has been used in several past studies seeking to explain police presence and action at protests. For my analysis, I restrict the data to New York State to eliminate the main source of selection bias in newspaper data, which is geographic bias. I run two logistic regression models, one predicting police presence and one predicting police intervention, whether police made arrests, used force, or both at protests. And my focal independent variable is a dichotomous variable indicating whether or not one of the protest claims, protest could be listed as furthering up to 4 claims. So if one of the protest claims was one of the several anti-police brutality claims coded for in the data set, there's several different anti-police brutality claims that are specific to different groups. For example, protests could be coded as making claims against police brutality against African Americans, against Native Americans, or against LGBT individuals. So I also include measures of threat and weakness that have been used as predictors of police presence and action in previous studies. This is critical in this case because it's very reasonable to expect that anti-police brutality claims may be correlated with other factors known to increase police response, such as the presence of minority protesters or the use of more confrontational tactics. For the model predicting police intervention, I use bivariate probit model, a type of Heckman selection model used when the dependent variable in the outcome equation, in this case, predicting police intervention, and the selection equation, in this case, predicting police presence, are both dichotomous. So as the results of the logistic regression on police presence shows in this table, protests that are about police brutality are significantly more likely to draw police than protests about other issues, even after controlling for measures of threat and weakness, many of which also help explain police presence at protests. Consistent with previous studies, this model shows that police presence is more likely at protests with other radical goals, larger protests, protests that target the state, and protests that use confrontational tactics or a greater variety of tactics. Protests with counter demonstrators present or where protesters engage in violence are also much more likely to draw police presence, as are protests that don't make the front page news or are organized by minority protesters, both of which are expected to make the protests more vulnerable to repression. My focus in this talk is simply the effect of a protest making claims about police brutality, net of these previously studied predictors of protest policing, but I'm happy to discuss any of these predictors shown to impact police response in greater detail in the Q&A. So, putting this in terms of predicted probabilities, we see that police are about twice as likely to attend protests against police brutality compared with other protests. The base predicted probability of police presence is calculated by setting all the dichotomous independent variables to 0 and all other independent variables to their means. When we change only the anti-police brutality claim variable to a 1, this raises the probability of police presence from 7% to 13%. This means that this factor alone nearly doubles the likelihood that police will be drawn to a protest. Now turning to police intervention once at the protest, that is specifically arrest and/or the use of force or violence against protesters. Once police are present at a protest, we see similar results. The effect of the anti-police brutality claim variable is still significant, although now at the 0.05 level rather than 0.001 level. Some of the other factors that help predict police presence also help predict police intervention here, consistent also with previous studies. More specifically, all of the threat indicators that were significant in the presence model are still significant in the intervention model, but the weakness indicators were no longer significant. The base probability that once present, police would take some action at protests, that is, make, arrest, or use force or violence against protesters, is 31%. When the protest is about police brutality, this climbs to 43%. In other words, they intervene at nearly half of protests against police brutality compared to about 1 in 3 protests making other claims. Only confrontational tactics, the use of violence by protesters, are by a small margin exceed anti-police brutality claims in their power to provoke force and/or arrest by police. So throughout US history, as well as outside of the US, people have periodically come together to demand reform of police conduct, especially the disproportionate use of force against marginalized groups. And like protests on other issues, these demonstrations have often been an important way for communities to voice grievances, to hold authorities responsible, change policies, and shift public attention and discourse. But these protests present a unique dilemma compared with other protests for the police department's tasked with policing them. I explore this dynamic and find that despite the possibility that reputational concerns would lead police to deal with such protests with special caution, police on average actually react to the threat posed by these protests with a more heavy-handed response than other protests. I extend Earl and Sewell's blue approach by considering how a specific, previously unexamined form of threat to police, challenges to their authority and legitimacy in the form of claims against police brutality, shapes protest policing. Whereas Earl and Sewell's blue approach attends to the situational threats posed to police by protests, I am focused on what is better understood as a symbolic threat. Protest claims challenging police legitimacy and authority, and demonstrate the power of such a symbolic threat to drive police action. Together with previous findings, my study strengthens the case for threat as the primary driver of differential police response to protests. It also lends credence to the anecdotal impression held by many that police responded especially harshly to recent police brutality protests, and particularly in 2020, and calls into question the extent to which negotiated management and content neutral protest policing were ever truly adopted by police when it comes to protests to which they were arguably the most ideologically opposed. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and we'll turn it over to the moderators.
Thank you, Professor Reynolds-Stenson. Again, great presentation, and we're great on time. So our schedule was to have around 20 minutes for questions and answers,